thank you very much, the group Chitr Sanstha as well, for inviting me to give this talk. Hopefully you can all hear me. Great. Okay, so here we are then. So I'll say a little bit about my background as well. As Udit rightly mentioned, I come from a sort of a practice background, working as a photographer, as a filmmaker, and also as a interdisciplinary critical urbanist, someone that's actually looking at urban spaces, city spaces. So much of my work involves walking around cities around the world. Often when I go to conferences or to symposia or to seminars or things like that, I try to build in time to actually walk around the cities as well. That's another project, another conversation for another event. But today I'm really going to be focusing on the London project, which was done over 20 years. And it really came from a series of walks. And many of you will be doing similar projects where you work over time. This sort of idea that anthropologists and cultural geographers, sociologists, refer to as longitudinal study. That's a sort of study that's done over time. And there is an assumption that if you're engaging with an open space and you're doing it over time, that engagement is stretched out. There's a certain degree of elasticity in there, but also the more time you spend on the street, the more you sort of get to know that urban space as well. That's quite a problematic assumption, I think, and actually one of my projects is about trying to unpack that. One of my other projects is about trying to unpack that assumption as well, this idea of actually not knowing too much about space. But this is really about a city that's my city. It's a city that I grew up in. I was born in London and I was raised in London. And it's really about a series, excuse me, of walks around that particular space. It's a massive project. It was done over 20 years. I landed up with, I think it was about 120,000 negatives. And it was very, very difficult in terms of trying to make sense of it, in terms of archiving it. So again, I'll have a little bit of a chat about that in terms of how do you make sense, especially when you're dealing with an analog project. How do you make sense of a massive archive as well? I'll talk a little bit about developing a project, this idea of, as I said before, knowing a city, and also some of the issues, the kind of core issues that coalesce around this idea of an ethical position to take. I mean, you know, very famously, some street photographers are very almost proud of the fact that they work within, as they would describe it, a field that shouldn't really be cognizant or mindful of any kind of ethical restraints. And that's something that that's a position that I categorically reject. I think it's actually incumbent on photojournalism and on street-based work, and certainly critical urban photography, to actually think very carefully about the impact that you have on the people around you, but also some of the sort of politics of representation as well that are linked into that as well. So I'll start with a series. I'll just start by showing a few images, and then we can talk about some of those things. Now, for those of you that are interested in such things, this is the camera, or this isn't the camera. I've had 8 of these, but I tend to work with one of these things, which is a Leica M6. I've worked with MPs as well. But this is the kind of camera that actually works quite well for me. It's nice and light. It's very, very robust. The glass is just absolutely excellent. I've done quite a lot of conflict-based photography as well in riots and things like that, and in other environments where all sorts of things are happening. So it's been very useful to actually have a piece of kit that when you drop it, or when it gets you know, taken out of your hands or whatever, or someone chucks a brick at it, or a police officer hits it with a baton, they always seem to survive. So that's one of the reasons why I've worked with that. Of late, I've been working with bigger cameras, with medium format and large format cameras. And I have to say that there is something lovely about walking around the streets with something light and unobtrusive. So this is an image from London Bridge that you're seeing. It's quite strange looking at it now, because when you look from that direction across to London Bridge Station. Of course, you've got the Shard there now. So this was made 30 years ago, thereabouts, about 28 years ago. And of course, there is no Shard. So, oh, what's happening here? And initially, when I made the first edit, I actually thought, well, most of these images are going to be horizontally based, they're going to be landscape based. And then I realized that actually I was working in a mixed fashion with vertical and horizontal images. This is an image from Brockwell Park in Brixton. And it's an odd image because it was just at that point, it was in the summer during a big fair there. And I spent some time looking at people on this contraption, on this fairground ride, as a kind of centrifugal force where they're being pushed out to the boundaries. And I noticed that this was under a path where lots of planes were coming over. And I realized then that there was a kind of conversation, or there could be a sort of compositional conversation taking place between the images of the plane, of the person, the painting on the structure, and the people being pushed through the air. Many of the images that I make are concerned with human gesture and contact. What does it mean for people to be moving through urban space, but also sometimes to be looking back at the photographer as well. So I don't have this view that, you know, which some, you know, defining street photographers would describe as objectivity or kind of an observational detachment. I'm very much interested in how people recognize my presence. Sometimes people don't, because I'm working very lightly and they don't notice, but I do like the moments where people actually look back and see me. Sometimes things happen where people are just completely oblivious to my presence. This is outside the British Museum. And this mask, it was a massive sculpture, was only there for a period of time and then it went. It just suddenly wasn't there. But it was only afterwards when I printed the image, when I looked at it, I really became aware that where the rain was coming down on the mask, on the sculpture, there was a point at which it was actually dripping down like a tear. And it sort of set up a whole new set of meanings for me. And also the way in which the man on the right is touching the lips of the sculpture. It's very, very sensual, very tactile. Sometimes scale is really important as well. I'm interested in how light works in urban spaces. People disappearing, small, people becoming small, almost insignificant objects within a greater architectural space as well. I did a series of images from Trafalgar Square, and it was part of a series of walks I did when I was at Central St Martin's, just up the road. The main art school has now moved up to King's Cross, but when I was there in the film school, it was up in Covent Garden. So at lunchtime, I used to come down and walk around central London, particularly around Trafalgar Square. And one of the things that really hit me on my perambulations around this particular space was the way in which people made sense of the space, the way in which they occupied the space, but also the way in which these roots seemed to be apparent. If you spend enough time really looking at urban space, you start to see that people walk through space and interact with space in what the urban sociologist Henri Lefebvre describes as kind of rhythms. He writes very eloquently about rhythm analysis. And I think a lot of urban-based street photography or street-based urbanism, visual urbanism, is really concerned with this idea of analysing, making sense of, recognising the rhythms around us. Now, on this particular occasion, you can see the figure of death is actually walking through the space. And I was intrigued by this. And what actually happened was the figure noticed me and noticed that I was photographing, and just simply walked through the space. And it turned out that it was a she, and she was on her way to some sort of party, a fancy dress party, but had actually got the times wrong. It turned up early, so she was walking around the square just to, as it were, to kill time. Obviously the kind of reaction that she got was quite something to see. But also what occurred to me later, and I didn't really see it, I think, at the time, because it was a split second, was the bird, the shadow of the bird that seems to be alighting from her shoulder, or perhaps coming onto the shoulder. And again, this speaks to the space, because at that time, before pigeons were banned by our then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, there were pigeons everywhere. But also there were sort of spectres. They were like sort of ghosts in the system. Similarly, a couple of young Italians in a group of tourists were there, and they were worried about the pigeons, and they had just decided to cover their heads because they were worried about the pigeons dropping their packages on them. And I did notice this when I was there, when I was actually photographing. I saw the two, the man on the right, you can see on his backpack, there are two faces, which sort of reflected in many ways the image, the faces of the young women on the left as well. So this idea of juxtaposition seems to be in connection in terms of composition and in terms of concept, seems to be something that works very well for me. This is an image of a family, actually. The man on the left, you can see his arm, was a painter, and he was an artist, a commercial street artist, and he was doing this for a living. And he would invite people to be drawn, and then his daughter would be messing around and just walking around. But I noticed after several weeks of talking to him, sometime, it's probably more than several weeks actually, over the summer, he got, we got chatting, and he was asking me what I was doing, and I explained what I was doing. And then he would see me and sort of just carry on doing what he was doing. And that was actually really helpful, because it meant that I could work around him, and there was no real problems about working that close with him as well. But his daughter would go through a ritual of sort of hanging from the bar upside down and looking out over the landscape upside down. And it was only many years later, and it was years later actually, it was maybe about 10 years later, something like that, when I was actually printing up the archive. I thought, well, I wonder what's written on that bag. I'll use the cursor. Do you see the bag there in the background? And I wondered what that actually meant in terms of thinking about the things that are hidden. They're sort of hidden in plain view, but they are there, but they are hidden. And when I looked at it closely under the enlarger, I could see that the words were a dictionary description of art, this notion of what art is. And I thought that was actually quite interesting, because of course you've got the juxtaposition of the child looking at the world upside down, and then you've got a definition of art as well, just to her left. And I think that's actually quite a poetic juxtaposition, but also a hidden juxtaposition. So at the time I wasn't really aware. And I think what that does introduce is this notion that we work not just within spaces of consciousness, but also within subliminal spaces as well. There are times sometimes where we don't necessarily know what we're looking at, and sometimes we have to step back, and it might be a spatial thing, but it's also sometimes a temporal thing, where we take time out, we take time to consider, and then sometimes the image reveals things that we couldn't necessarily see when we were in the space of making. Quite a lot of my work has been focusing on conflict. So a number of the images are really about how people navigate through landscapes of descent and change as well. And of course, you know, of late, we've seen massive changes in urban spaces. People have been out on the streets because of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. But back in the days when I was making this work, back in the 80s, people were out, and it was a very different space to actually photograph in, because there just simply weren't people out with mobile phones and things like that. So if you were a photographer, often you would be treated with some hostility, because people wouldn't necessarily know who you were, what you were doing, why you were there, and they would be quite suspicious often. It did actually help my not being there with a large press camera. So actually working with small cameras like Leicas meant that I was considered to be less of an irritant, shall we say. I think press photographers often had it very, very bad if they were working with a large camera, because they were being often targeted by the police. And I'd done it, you know, I'd been out in riots with large cameras, and it was very difficult because often you'd get the camera battened by police officers with large bully sticks, you know. So it was actually quite refreshing to be out there with a smaller camera. And again, when we talk about this, when we have a discussion, we might want to think about what kind of changes we've seen taking place. This is from a group in the UK called the Nation of Islam, who had an event in Trafalgar Square, and again, it was quite difficult. You know, I mean, I've been photographing for years, so actually they knew who I was, so it actually made it easier for me to actually get in fairly close and do some photographs. But I was very interested in, again, the way in which the space itself was kind of working, and that ladder, that white ladder that's just going up into the space where the lions are, and of course you've got a couple of lookouts. They were very concerned about any potential conflict for the day as well. Many of my images are from things that I just come across. So I was interested in this. There was a group of Canadian, I think they were reenactment people, but they were in some sort of clan band, you know, they're obviously of Scottish ancestry. And I was quite fascinated by what this man had in his sporran. And then also, again, the juxtaposition with the cardboard cutout of the Indian woman. She's got this kind of framing which gives her a halo as well. And I think that, you know, there's a space in photography, in street photography and urban photography, which is really concerned with that which is on the borderlines of if not directly humorous, then maybe it's borderline humour. Sometimes I look at photographs, or I look at the scene of photographs, and I can't really work out how black and white works in relation to colour. And this is a really good example of that. When I look at this photograph, I see colour. I don't really see black and white. And the reason being is because this woman who was, for some reason, trying to step over this fence into a load of rose bushes, or whatever they were, to get closer to the water area. This is in Battersea Park in southwest London, very close to Chelsea. And her ice cream, or lolly, was a vibrant yellow and a lurid green and pink. And I wasn't sure that this would actually work very well. I wasn't sure at all. But actually, to my mind, it does work, because it strips out the colours, but it becomes very much about tone. And you can imagine the sky was bright blue, the ice cream was, you know, very, very bright, and the band that you can see on her back was a sort of yellow, a light yellow, and the water itself was a kind of greeny blue as well, and the plants were green. Yet somehow I was able to make a translation. I don't think that photographic theory does the theory of translation very well. And there is this idea that black and white is a kind of a cop-out and that it's easier to do than colour. And I think that's a total misreading of practice, actually. And I think that often the people that are indulging, shall we say, in that series of theoretical speculations are more often than not people that haven't actually done photography. I work extensively in colour. I love working in colour. But I can tell you this much, there's an immediacy. It's a bit like, in IT, they used to have that term WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. If you're looking at a scene and you see reds and greens and primaries and all sorts of things, what you would hope to achieve is some sort of closeness to that in terms of the end result. When you're looking at a scene in black and white, you're having to look at it differently because you're thinking about how tone and how tonal proximity and juxtaposition works. So actually, I think it's more difficult to actually do, and it might be useful for people that work in photographic education and write theory about this to actually start being a little bit more nuanced in terms of their critical approaches to this. I worked in Deptford. I lived in Deptford when I was studying anthropology at Goldsmiths. I did a postgrad there, and then I was there as a fellow, a research fellow in the Centre for Urban and Community Research before I the MA in photography and urban cultures, and then started convening it. So I knew some of the people that were out and about. This was a very famous anchor. Deptford was very much associated with Imperial, the kind of Navy, and the building of the Navy under Henry VIII, and various Russian czars. Peter the Great, for instance, came and lived in Deptford, and he was actually apprenticed to the main ship makers there. So at the end of the road in Deptford, there's an anchor. And the problem with it was that the anchor became, when I say it's a problem, it was defined as a problem by the local authority, but the anchor became a meeting up point where people would go to drink. And I knew most of the drinkers because I used to go down to local cafes or to shop on the market or whatever. And I was quite intrigued by this particular character who I'd photographed before. I'd done some portraits of, and I wanted to try and get him when he was a bit more relaxed with a fag, with a cigarette. And this was on a Saturday morning, fairly early actually. Sometimes people look back. This idea of interactions, again, looking at space, I was fascinated by this background as a boarded up shop in very close to Leicester Square tube station. And I was really interested in what was happening in terms of people walking past. And this man walked past with a rolled up poster. It looks like he's prodding the other man in the back, but he was actually kind of hitting it on his hand in a kind of rhythmic way. I made quite a few images from Notting Hill Carnival, and this man had just decided that the best place to sit and drink his wine was going to be on some, you don't really see them at all now actually, but some phone boxes there. I mean, we still have the old red, that everyone knows, the kind of classical London phone boxes. But he decided that this was a great place to sit, and he was there for some time, some considerable time, just drinking his wine and watching what was happening around him. I was interested also in how people, again, were looking at me photographing as well. And I think to some degree, if you look through the phone box, you can see an African woman standing there, and she was again watching me in terms of what I was doing. From the same space, just around the corner from there, I photographed some children. It's very difficult. It's difficult to be doing urban-based photography or doing street-based photography to photograph children now within the British context because of many of the moral panics, some real, some imagined, about adults actually photographing children. And I was there for some time, just walking around photographing and trying to avoid photographing children. And then someone approached me and said, I've sort of been watching you photographing. Why aren't you photographing my kids? And I said, well, because I'm blah, 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 and I'm doing this project. And she said, well, who are you doing it for? And I told her, and I said, well, actually, I'm based in a sociology department and actually working around this project as a form of sort of study of urban space. And she said, "Oh, that's great, you know, let me introduce you to some people." So she did. And there was a bunch of other mothers there who were sitting around with their kids. And she then said, "Oh, well, actually, you know, I'm the chair of the local tenancy group," which was quite interesting. So basically, I was in that space for probably about another hour, just walking around photographing. And it really helped things because it meant that people knew who I was, what I was doing, and they didn't have to worry about you know, where these images would land up. Maybe they'd land up on the internet in spaces that they didn't want them to be. Well, that was pre-internet, of course. That would have been back in the late 90s. I think, again, that's an important point to be made. The social landscape isn't passive. It looks back at you and it tries to make sense of what you're doing. And unless you're in a position where you have some sort of reason for being there. I mean, I'll give you an example. You know, if you'd have turned up with a flash and done, you know, what a lot of street photographers do, which is just to turn up, run at people, push their flash into people's faces. In that instance, you would have been lucky to have come out. If someone had done that in that space at Notting Hill Carnival with those mothers around, all sorts of issues would have then come out of that. And the person doing that would have been lucky to have actually come out of that space, probably in one piece. And that's understandable. And so again, this thing of how do you engage? How do you create a kind of legend for yourself? How do you actually tell people what you're doing? What's your story, you know, for being there? Is that absolutely essential to that as well? Again, just on Notting Hill, people looking, it was starting to rain. That seems to be a big feature of photographing in London, just continuous, unanticipated rain. This was in Brick Lane, and I've been photographing around a number of the streets that just sort of span off from the main sort of drag down Brick Lane. And I noticed this reproduction of Rembrandt as an older man. You probably all know that there was a series of paintings, and this was one of the last paintings of him. And there was a young boy that used to walk around. I didn't get to know him, but I got to see him quite a bit with his friends. And he would always seem to be walking around with spare parts from bikes and things like that. I guess he was building bikes or whatever he was doing, and spray cans. But people would stop to look at things. And this idea of how the flow of life moves and how people actually take time out to stop, not just to look at each other, but to look at objects within the urban landscape is quite central to that. But just up the road, around the corner at the end of Brick Lane, there was a very famous area where the local neo-Nazis, what was then the British National Party, that came out of the National Front. There's a long tradition within British far-right sort of associations of people turning up to places and intimidating people, claiming the flag, singing loudly, all those sorts of things. And at that particular time, this was during the early 90s, there was a lot of violence. So actually the East End was a very, very, it could be a very dangerous place to be, because there was a lot of direct action fascist stuff going on, but also quite a lot of anti-fascist direct action stuff going on. So you could find yourself actually caught up in that very, very easily. And I'd grown up in Greenwich, which was where not when I was a child, but later on, it was where the British National Party headquarters was based. So I'd grown up around quite a few people whose politics was, very different to mine. And it was actually, in many ways quite a difficult space to grow up in. And later on, of course, it became exploited by the far right. And as I said, they set up their national headquarters there. And so I was out photographing on the street, and I saw this group of neo-Nazis. Again, they got used to me being there because I was there every week. And they'd always say, I can't photograph. And I just said, yes, I can. And sometimes there'd be threats of violence, and I could look after myself, and I did look after myself if I had to. So that they just got to the point where they got so fed up with me being there, they just knew that I would make some photographs and then wander off somewhere, So, but sometimes they'd sort of stare into the camera, and you get this kind of long, sort of attempt to appear to be threatening. This guy who's staring into the camera actually wasn't from London. He was from, we think he was from Milton Keynes, and he'd come down for a big event where there was about maybe 30, 40 Nazis with the flags. And it just goes to show, how incredibly naive he was, because I saw him about an hour later, and at that point, the whole area was full of anti-fascists everywhere. And he was in a bagel shop, having a bagel, just standing outside, and everyone's seen him on the picket. And of course, the great irony was that the bagel shops in Brick Lane are owned by Jewish families, most of them. I think it's two main ones. And he was, someone that was part of a profoundly anti-Semitic party, enjoying a very, very fine Jewish bagel. I like things that don't make sense. So this was actually just literally, if you walk down that lane, the image that you saw before of the young boy with the bicycle wheel was just to the left at the end there. So again, I'd go back over and over and over. I was photographing in Brick Lane for, throughout the duration of the project. I was there for about 20 years, and I'd be there many, many Sundays. I don't know how many. It must have been hundreds of Sundays, and some Saturdays and some weekdays as well. I should say that I was also based around, before I went to work at Goldsmiths, I was a research fellow on a project about the impact of the 1989 Children Act, just around the corner in the sociology department. So it meant that I had lots of friends that lived in the area, and I had a kind of reason, I felt, to be there as well. Again, going back, one of those lovely sort of, places where you could go and find, in those days, they were quite old cameras then, but people would go and come along and haggle, just market stall, but people come along and look at cameras and haggle and decide and try and get decent prices for them as well. Perennial rain, young kids not using umbrellas, but using boxes, adapting. This image is from the London Underground, and there's quite a lot of images that I made travelling up and down, sometimes on my way to things, like to work, or sometimes I would have a day and just take the day off, or a long afternoon or an evening, and just move backwards and forwards. And this was actually of a couple of people, nuns that lived opposite where I live, in Clapham, very close to where I live in Clapham, at a convent there. They wouldn't really talk, because I'm not sure if they're allowed to talk to people. But there was a strange moment where I think she probably recognised me, because she would have seen me for some years, and she was looking directly at me, and I sort of made a flinch, just held her gaze. And nothing was really said. There were no words. But again, it's this idea of how an image works. Sometimes when you're looking at it later, sticking to what we know best, the advert above her head says. This is from an image from one of the fairgrounds that I attended. It's a really strange image. It's quite a dark image about oblivion. I spent about nearly an hour, I'd say, just waiting for this to hit the right space, because the lights were all over the place. And when it got to the apex, it got to the top of the movement, invariably the lights weren't on. So I was quite interested in, and I am interested in how we anticipate things by looking at things and hoping that they come together. A lot of the time it's failure. A lot of the time we hope things will work. We see an image, we have an idea in our mind of what might constitute a good image, and it doesn't necessarily come together. And so this idea of a kind of observational detachment, a sort of documentary detachment, I think does become very problematic, because most of the time we are actually mediating, we're actually thinking about an image when we're in a space of making, which is really concerned with our concept of what holds an image together in terms of composition, in terms of the elements in the frame, all those things. And for me, this is an image that actually did come together because it sort of says what I wanted it to say. So I think we do have to unpack some of the core philosophical underpinnings of documentary in terms of this sort of unproblematic, or this notion of an unproblematic engagement with the world. I see most photography as being constructive, if not constructed, because it's very much about us going out, imagining what may be the outcome of an interaction, and then hoping that those interactions come together in some meaningful way. Been working quite a bit around trees and the shadows that they cast as people walk through spaces. I did go through a period where I started photographing couples, and this was actually just outside, this is just at the end of Pride. This couple had been out, and I think they were very happy. And I was standing very close. And it's funny because the woman looked up and saw me photographing, and she smiled at me and just went back to hugging her boyfriend. And it's made me think about this in terms of what we understand by permission. I mean, I'm based in the sociology department, so we have whole series of protocols and understandings around what it means to record people in public spaces. We've got something called the British Sociological Association that gives a set of guidelines. But there are times when permission is actually given, sometimes through people's eyes. And sometimes you're in a position where there's actually a public interest position to take around photographing as well. I mean, there is no public interest position here, but they were very much aware that I was there, and I think that they were part of that. Really, I think they wanted, and I didn't explain what the project was about or anything because they were just too busy hugging each other. I've been photographing people sleeping for some time as well. It's quite unusual because it's a London cab that's parked on a double yellow line. But I loved the juxtaposition of the sleeping cab, who's lit from this lovely light coming in from the windows, and this figure in the advert, who's asleep on a very soft-looking, very comfortable-looking floating feather as well. This is at Princess Diana's funeral, and amongst all of this utter chaos, I mean, there were just hundreds and hundreds of film crews and journalists from all over the world. There was this technician, this TV technician, who was just sleeping. And he was obviously very practiced at it because he brought his own pillow along. And he was there. I walked past, I came back about 15 minutes later and he was still there, just sleeping soundly. And there's all this mayhem and chaos apparently appears to be chaos going on around him, but somehow he managed to keep sleeping. Back to Deptford. I've been working on a series of carnival photographs, and I was invited to go and photograph a local black group, an African Caribbean group, that were prepping up for Carnival as well. And they were in a local park testing out their lovely costumes. I was really interested in the figure on the left. And again, it was sort of serendipitous in the sense that how could you possibly plan something like that? You know, there was a gust of wind and the headgear was blown up into that really interesting shape. Again, you sometimes see things, and sometimes you have to react to things as well. And sometimes you react subliminally, and it's when you start to do the printing you understand what you've reacted to. It's in Kensington, and this was really at the beginning of the project, back in the early middle of the 1980s in 1986. So the project spanned from 1986 to 2006. And this man saw me. I wasn't photographing. I was actually photographing the wedding dresses, which of course now look very old and very dated, very 1980s like. And he saw me and sort of walked into frame and just adjusted himself, adjusted his lapel and everything, waited for me to photograph. Didn't say a word. I think he must have heard the click of the camera and then just walked off. Children making the most of the snow in Greenwich Park. And they weren't using sledges, they were using purloined estate agent boards as well. This is from Greenwich Park as well. I did a series there. And again, if you look at the landscape, if you look at the actual horizon line, there's Canary Wharf. If you go back now, there's tens of large skyscrapers. So it's all very different. I did a series on, again, as I said before, on riots. And there was a group called Reclaim the Streets who used to regularly go out onto the streets. Sometimes they would just take their clothes off. Again, it's very difficult. You would have to explain to people what you were doing. You really couldn't just photograph people walking around naked unless they knew, unless they were comfortable with you as well. It's closed now. This is the penguin pool at the London Zoo. This was during Pride. I'm not sure what the backstory was. I think the couple had just got married or they were just on their way to get married. This is Charlie and his daughter, and they're just on their way to the vets with their pet duck. And I was really intrigued because without going into his background, Charlie was a very, very well-known local character in South London, and he was you know, he had a very colourful, as I say, background, and he was considered to be quite a tough guy, but I always got on really well with him. And again, it helped because that was his daughter Louise, by the way, and it sort of helped because I'd worked in adult education, and I'd actually met him on one of the estates I'd worked in. And when I saw him, I was going up to Goldsmiths and I saw him walking down the road with their duck. I just said, you know, hi Charlie, and you know, do you mind if I didn't have to explain anything. He sort of knew because he'd seen me around for years photographing, and he thought it was hilarious. I need to find him, and I need to give him this photograph as well. Again, a series of images from windows looking out. You can see there actually that already from the previous one that we saw of the skyline from Greenwich Park, there's only one tower block, skyscraper, and already this would have been back in the later 1990s, probably about 98, 99. They're starting to go up at pace. Again, I'm very much interested in people sleeping. This is the old London Underground. I love the image. I love the idea of the man falling asleep, but he's got his thumb in the book. So it's like when he wakes up, and that's what he was doing actually. So he'd go to sleep, doze off for a bit, then he'd wake up, read a bit, and then go back. And I sort of pretty much followed him for about 5, 6, 7 stops, something like that. People in the street walking past. And the way in which light sometimes falls can be very, very odd. I've done some work about urban animals. I'm really interested in how cats and dogs and other animals look back at us and make sense of us, and they study us, and it's amazing to watch. People, children looking back at us, animals sometimes looking back at us. This was during an event and a young man was changing his son's, or I take to be his son's nappy. And the boy, he sort of knew I was there, and the boy was fascinated by this man who was standing there. So this idea of light, this idea of looking, this was very late at night, and this man was probably planning what he was going to buy the next day. I've been photographing, as I said, in riots, and in many ways this was the starting point of when I realised that I wasn't going to really be a proper photojournalist in that sense, because I've been out photographing in a big industrial dispute, And I realised once this riot was underway that I didn't want to get back. I was on placement. I was just finishing at LCC, the photojournalism course. So I'd been attached to the Independent. So I was expected to get back to get my films in so I could get them out. And actually, I didn't want to go back to the darkroom or back to the picture desk. I wanted to stay and see what happened. And actually, once the photographers had left, because this was obviously pre-digital, so you weren't wiring your stuff, you weren't sending it down the line. You had to physically get your stuff to a runner, to a biker, to a bike courier, or take it back yourself. So a lot of people left, a lot of photographers and journalists left to get their stories in by the deadline. And I stayed on. And once they'd gone, the whole approach of the police changed. Their tactics completely changed, just like that. It was quite extraordinary to see. And that convinced me that actually, if you want to do work on a city, being able to do it over time and in your own space and being able to make sense of that, what you're seeing in your own time and your own space, was an integral part of that process. And I think that's really where the concept of critical urbanism or engaged urbanism starts to come in, I think. This was during the, again, one of the big sort of, it wasn't really a riot actually at all, but it was a sort of civil disobedience action where they, a group of people reclaimed the city, took over the N1 motorway. I think it was the M1 motorway. It's a huge motorway, and they decided to have a party on it. And I was quite interested in this woman who was, and her boyfriend, I think it was, who were kind of wandering around, having a great time. A man who was sort of, he'd been having a great time as well. But it was also this, the way the boy was, or the young man was looking under the tarpaulin to see what was there. And the woman with an image of someone shooting someone else in the head with the words bitch on. And I thought, well, that's kind of like, you know, so politically incorrect. But she chose, and she was out on an event, which was, you know, considered to be something that would have been, you know, very much associated with people with left-wing views. So I wasn't quite sure how that was going to pan out. This image, this idea of images of kind of relationship between the imagined world and the world of images and people in those spaces seems to be quite central as well. Man at a bus stop. Again, I can't explain why there was a man at a bus stop with a very large television waiting for a bus. I'm not sure he was ever going to get, I was actually on my way to somewhere to a meeting, so I couldn't hang around to find out what the outcome was, but he was sort of standing there with his television. And this again would have been in the late 90s. So if this had been in the middle of the 80s, I could sort of understand someone walking around with a piece of equipment like that. That's probably a collectible piece of technology now. There you go. So this idea of narratives that are contained within a frame that we can't explain, and we put them out to audiences, and we make them, and we try to make sense of them. And when we can't make sense of them, I still can't make sense of the image of the television and the man at the bus stop. And you know, we do our best to work with that. Now, this is, we're just nearly finishing now. This is an image which I kind of don't know where it is. I've got to do some archaeology around this. It's obviously at a fair. I think I know where it is, but I'm not entirely sure. So I've got to go back over the sequences and rethink what it is. I do remember it was shot on pooled 125 films, so it was pulled down to 100. And I worked on very, very low shutter speed, so it would have been about an 1/8 of a second or 1/15 of a second, probably, with the aperture quite wide open. I think it's one of those things where I'd obviously been out photographing during the day. It was quite sunny, and that's what I had in the camera, so I worked with it, not expecting it to come out. Not expecting it to come out to the point I don't think I even checked the film. And it was only when I was scanning the films, I thought, my goodness, what's this? And I didn't see it at the time. And I think that this really does bring into sharp relief this idea of how we actually edit, but also how we archive. And the last few images I'm going to show are from Greenwich. And again, in terms of thinking about the edit and the archive, how we put together something that has historical resonance. I think sometimes we make work when we're walking streets and we don't necessarily understand that that could be something that in the future could have all sorts of value. This is from a series of images I did around the murders of young black men in Greenwich during the rise of the kind of far right there. And they were very much active in recruiting young white boys who were in gangs, and we know what the outcome was. And this is from Roland Adams, and this is his father and his family walking around the area where he was murdered. This is from Stephen Lawrence's funeral, and I lived very close to this, so I got to know the family very well. And I was at the funeral, and there was, well, you can't see, is on the left. There's about 30 photographers with long lenses, and I was working with a 28mm lens with my Leica. And I just thought, you know, what I need to do is to stand very close to the family so I can photograph Stephen coming into the church. And his relative, his young relative, was looking at me and asking me, when is he coming in? And there's a kind of an interesting, quite a vital connection that's being made there. I got to work very closely with the Lawrences, with Neville and Stephen's mum Doreen. And I remember talking to Neville about this photograph. I wasn't in the position where I could check with them that I could stand there or photograph. And they were very happy that I was there, because this was used in the film that I made for Channel 4. And a lot of feedback came from this particular image in terms of how it helped their campaign for justice for Stephen during one of the riots that took place with the bookshop as well. And we're nearly, I think, at the end, so I'll just keep going. Again, this idea, there's a couple of aliens walking past and a man who's sitting there looking back. I was actually really photographing the aliens, but then became quite interested in terms of him looking at me photographing the aliens. This is from just outside the ICA, and it's a couple that have just got married, actually, and they got married. They'd stopped while they were running the marathon at London, the London Marathon, and they'd stopped to get married and then carried on running. And she doesn't look particularly happy. I think she just wanted to get changed, have a shower, maybe go off on the honeymoon, maybe. But what was interesting was that there was a group of amateur photographers who were out doing some street work, and the man on the left with the striking ponytail, it was kind of extraordinary, because he was walking around looking for images, but sort of missing the image that was actually in front of him. And so I decided that was the image. And I think when we make images on the street, we are within that single frame. Sometimes we're working with combinations of frames, a photo edit, a photo essay, but often we're trying to tell a story, which isn't a singularity, but it is a story within the frame. And I think it's fundamentally a mistake to think of a photograph as a singularity. I think that the way the human eye works, the way that human perception works, but the way in which you scan across a photograph, it's almost a time-based piece of media. In art schools, you talk about, in theory, art theory and media theory, you talk about time-based media, film as being, you know, having the additional dimension, which is time, and that photography should be thought of as being instantaneous and two-dimensional. And I actually totally reject that as a proposition, as a concept. I think that photographs are actually time-based media, and the way in which we make sense of them is that we actually scan through, we move around, and our eyes move around the image as well. Sometimes there's silence. I think a lot of photography really is concerned with the possibility of silence, that we look into, we gaze into a photograph, and when we're making photographs, we're gazing into those spaces, and we're listening but we're letting the eye do the work of silence as well, because it becomes a meditative space. Sometimes we can get distracted and we're just, it's all about the immediate, it's about the immediacy of things, it's about the noise and the clutter and all those things. And I think sometimes it's really useful as urban photographers just to step back and say, well, what's happening to me? What am I seeing here? What am I experiencing? But also, what are people around me experiencing as well? And these are really the last two images. So this is from the Italian festival in Farringdon, and it's of an angel that's been basically chained to a float. The float was actually late leaving, so she couldn't go anywhere because she was, what you don't see is that she's chained to a pole. And there was a young mother with a pram walking past with a blow-up balloon sort of Dalmatian. The really weird thing was that this was made in the late 90s, and I was there last year photographing, last year with my big medium format camera, and I saw exactly the same thing. There was someone walking past with an inflatable dog Dalmatian on a piece of string, and it was a very strange moment for me, thinking, well, maybe it's a tradition. Maybe there's one person whose role is to walk around the festival, the event, with an inflatable Dalmatian. And really, this is the last image. I think this is the last image from the series, which is of a man who's stopped to think about things. And really, for me, what this throws up is a series of questions about how we make sense of what's in front of us. What are we seeing? I mean, I don't know if he was praying. I don't know if he was just tired. I walked past him and saw him still there, and I walked back, set my camera and photographed him. But we bring to this narratives. You know, we don't know who he is. He might be a person that's working in human resources. He might be someone that's actually facing a difficult time. Perhaps his company are going to announce redundancies that day. Who knows? But we carry to the act of looking when we photograph an idea, a kind of a schema about how the world might be. And then also, that's when we're making photographs, but also when we're actually looking at them, we carry through to the act of looking our own biographies, our own collective biographies, but also our own individual biographies as well. If you're interested in having a look at some of my work, this particular project isn't up on this website, but we're going up into a big new sparkling shiny website soon.
He says many thoughts but hard to articulate after seeing the volume and the large and the range of work. Very quietening. And from Mayur, it's any particular reason why you shoot black and white?
Okay, so two questions. So the first one is about the volume of work. Yeah, it's huge, and this is only one edit from the work. So the final iteration is going to be much bigger. It's going to be long. I like black and white. Actually, I really love working in black and white. I also love working in colour. And they are different projects. And because I started it in black and white, I wanted to finish it in black and white. My latest three projects are all in colour. And one of the projects, which I shot on made on a medium format camera, is in crazy super saturated colour as well. So it's not that I think that black and white is superior to colour, or that I think colour is superior to black and white, because I don't. I think that they're different media, and I think there are different ways of thinking about how you tell a story about the world that you live in as well. I do like black and white. I like the discipline of it. I love working with tone, and there are times actually when images that are stripped out of colour speak more eloquently, and then also vice versa. There are images which can only really be in colour for me, and I can't desaturate them. I can never think about stripping the colour out because they're in a colour project in the first instance. But even if they weren't, I would think of them as being colour images.
20 years of shooting London, it is documenting history, maybe a series of comparing the cultural differences, like in a dressing sense, or compilation of thing over a period of time.
Yeah, so spending 20 years photographing London wasn't something that I originally planned to do, and I wasn't really thinking of it in terms of it being a sort of sociological, anthropological, cultural geography of the space, because the space is just so diverse. But I think what happened was I sort of discovered almost sort of an interconnectivity between the spaces. And I think that's what happens when you walk through urban spaces, is that often you think that you're going to start somewhere, perhaps you start somewhere, and then you have a conversation, or you see something, or you overhear something, and you think, I think I might try going to that space. I think over time, I saw some very, very real differences. I mean, there were differences in place. I mean, I started out photographing when I was living in Chelsea, and that was incredibly different from Deptford. In fact, I went from living in Chelsea, travelled around a bit, went to Greece, I went to Scotland, and then came back. And as I was studying social anthropology at Goldsmiths, I decided to move into Deptford, which is basically one of the poorest. I think it then was officially the poorest ward, the poorest part of London. So I'd gone from Chelsea, which is the richest part of London, to the poorest part of London. The difference is now is that Deptford is no longer, it's poor, it's got poor parts, but it's also become noticeably gentrified as well.
Do you mix color and black and white together for a single project? Does it work visually for you?
No, I don't mix colour and black and white in a single project at all. I found through hard practice that if you try to do that, you get very, very confused. When I'm working with black and white, I think in black and white. I'm a film-based photographer, so I'm not working digitally, so it's not an option to shoot in colour and then just simply desaturate in post-production. So I did at one point, when I was doing more commercially based work and commercial photojournalism, at one point I used to carry 2, sometimes 3 bodies with me. And as I was often working with Leicas and things like that, I would have a colour film in one and black and white in the other. And that was an unmitigated disaster, because literally I'd see something and there'd be that moment of, now is this colour, or is this black and white? Which is not the position you want to be in if you're doing street-based urban photography. You know, you want to be able to respond as quickly as possible. So I ditched that. I did it for about maybe 2 or 3 years, and then I actually realised it was not practicable, and made a decision to just either work with colour or work with black and white. When I'm working with colour, I work again within a set of parameters. So I actually work with very slow film in the 35mm. Actually, in all cameras, if I'm working with 6x9 or my Rolleiflexes, I always work with slow film. I don't think I've ever worked with fast film, colour film, and I think that's to do again with saturation, and I want those kind of deep, rich colours.
Since you've been documenting London for over 20 years, how do you think the city or the streets have changed over a period of time, since you've been seeing it for a period of time?
I think I partly answered that question in question 1, but I think the biggest change that I've seen, I'll start that again if you want to cut this, Udit. I think the biggest change I've seen in photographing around London, I'm not sure I'm documenting, but certainly photographing around London, is the impact of urban change, of rather euphemistically called what's described as regeneration, but also urbanists, critical urbanists describe it as gentrification. And I think that that's been very noticeable in certain places. So I think if you go to the East End, it's quite extraordinary how much change has taken place. When I was photographing in the mid-80s, it was so run down and it was so poor. I was working very close to bricklayers, was working around the corner in a sociology department as a researcher. So it was actually very easy for me to get out at lunchtime and walk around with some of my friends there and photograph. And if you went to Brick Lane on a Sunday, the place was pretty quiet really. By about midday, maybe 1 o'clock, it's almost deserted. And if you go there now on a Sundays, well, now obviously because of COVID it's different, but if you were to go there under normal circumstances, it would be absolutely rammed, just packed. I mean, to the point where I think I went there last summer and you couldn't move. I mean, it was insane. There must have been thousands and thousands of people all squeezed in, packed into this very, very small space, having what they thought of as a authentic cultural experience about the East End of London.
With a vast project like this, which is an ever-changing one, how do you decide on the duration of the project, and how do you manage the volume of the photographs?
Yeah, this is a very good question about the idea of the volume, the idea of the changing nature of a project, and duration as well. So it's really three questions, I suppose, rolled into one. So duration is an issue, and it's an issue for all urban photographers. What's the starting point? What's the middle? What's the finish? If you've got a commission, if you're lucky enough to have a commission, you probably do have a sense of when you're starting and when you're finishing. But most self-initiated projects don't really work like that. So often people will start a project, not knowing, even though it's a project, they have an intuition or they have a series of walks and it produces something. And then it develops into something else. I think there is a lot of intuition involved. I think sometimes you actually have a sense that you're discovering something that's really relevant to you, and you're really excited by what you're discovering, and then you want to work with that discovery. So often you sometimes find the end of a project comes from external circumstances. It might be you run out of money. It might be that you have to move somewhere. It might be you change a job. It might be something like that. But I think often, certainly for me, projects finish when I've literally said what I want to say, or rather, perhaps the project has said what it wants to say through me. And at that point, it's then time to really stop. And actually, I do have a very strong sense of that because there are just times when I just don't want to, with certain projects, I just don't want to really complete it, to do any further work. I kind of know, looking at the images, that the project coheres and makes sense as it is. Archives is a big problem. If you're working with film-based work, as I am, just actually being able to manage such a volume is really, really difficult. So I think if you know you're going to be starting a project, a good starting point is to actually ask yourself that critical question: how am I going to manage the volume of images? Whether you're working with film or whether you're working digitally, it's still a big issue. Probably with digital, it's probably even more acute because, of course, you're dealing with a different range, different volume of images, because it's so much easier to make. When you're working with film, especially working with, I work with 6:9 and Rolleiflex square format films, it just gets so horrendously expensive that you do have to think very carefully about this notion, this idea of a kind of a ration.
Also, you mentioned earlier during your talk that you love how people look at you as a photographer. How have people's reaction to being photographed changed in the last 2 decades? And do you also feel, gender, race, or affluence difference? Do you witness that?
Again, this is a very, very good question. The way that people look at me, and I think the way that people actually look at photographers has changed over the last 20 years. When I first was out on the street photographing, there was a degree of ambivalence or even antipathy towards me as a photographer, as someone with a camera. I think now cameras are so ubiquitous. Everyone seems to have one, but also everyone's got a camera phone. So I think people are used to having people just photographing. And actually, when I'm walking around with a small rangefinder camera, people just don't even notice me now. Back in the day, when I was photographing in Deptford and in the East End and in certain other places, just to produce a camera created a sort of a bit of a panic, actually. And it's quite a curious thing, because walking, for instance, down Brick Lane 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Well, actually 30, even 33, 34, 35 years ago when I was right at the beginning. You produce a camera and people would scatter just actually having a camera walking down the street, and there'll be a reaction and people would start talking, well, either calling at you and saying, why have you got a camera, or they would be moving from the area. So I think that's changed. This idea of gender, race and affluence, they are factors. I think that sometimes, and there's a big discussion out there about how women photograph on the street, and we have to be careful about coming to a set of conclusions, formulaic, gender-based conclusions, based on sort of stereotypes and sort of tropes about masculinity and femininity. But I think that there is some truth in this idea that you sometimes see women operating in urban spaces much more fluidly and much more efficiently than men. And one of the things that I have seen a lot of actually in London is a kind of smash and grab in your face, it's a particular school of I'm not even sure I'd use the term documentary or even photojournalistic. It's a school of something, and I'm not sure quite what the word is. I'll have to think about that. But this idea that you go up to someone and you just push your camera in their face, you don't speak to them, you don't talk to them, possibly with a flash, you make no effort to engage with them, tends to be something that is coded with a degree of masculinity. I haven't seen many women, in fact, I can't really think of any women, any female photographers that I've seen in London or anywhere else that I've photographed around the world, having that kind of approach. People tend to be a lot more intuitive and a lot more empathetic. So I think that is actually a question. In terms of this notion of quote unquote race, there have been times where I've photographed, I'm of sort of mixed race heritage, if combination of sort of black and Scottish, but I see, identify as a black Londoner, and there have been times where I've photographed in situations where being perceived to be a man of colour, a person of colour, has definitely helped. It's given me access. And people have perceived me differently, particularly when it's been associated with some of the very difficult and challenging far-right stuff. I've had access to meetings, I've had access to events that I know that white photographers, even if they could have got the access, would have then struggled with once they'd had actually if they got the access, ever got the access. So I think actually being someone who can move around in certain spaces can actually be quite useful. So I think this idea of movement, the idea of sort of working with a legend, working with who you are and who you wish to be and who you want to project yourself as, is something that is familiar to many urban photographers.
What format does this kind of a project end up? Is it an exhibition? Does it go as sociological or anthropology study, white paper, book? Is that aspect something you've decided at the start of the project?
Again, a very good question. And the answer is simply, I don't know. So what happens is that I start projects without knowing where they're going to end, which is the opposite of how I was trained as a photojournalist. But it's also in many ways consistent with the way in which I was trained in an art school as an artist. So I tend to think about this idea of a kind of an unfolding or an unraveling of the story, and I don't necessarily know where the story goes. If you think about how poetry works, how many poets actually work out the exact structure? I'm sure that maybe Shakespeare did, or maybe some other people did as well, but I'm not sure that they would have an exact structure in mind before they actually started writing. And I think that urban photography, and when you're working in street environments, in cities, I think often it's the same thing. You go out, you look at what's there and what you perceive as being there. You have the experiences space and things in space and all these things. And then you try and make sense of what you've got, what you've seen. You might go back, you might do some more work, you might loiter in a certain space, but often you're really dependent on this, as I said, this sort of unraveling. And I think that there has to be almost a kind of theory around that. I think generally people that write photographic theory of street-based work in particular tend to fall back on a number of traditions which are borrowed from documentary or from photojournalistic or street-based or street photography. And I think this idea of kind of not really knowing but discovering, I think, is really exciting. I think part of that also links into where the work lands up, because I don't know. I've got some very large projects. I've got 5 projects I'm just about to put up onto websites after many years of working on them and not having to really worry too much about putting them up. And then I've got another 3 projects I'm hoping to get completed next year. And then there's another 2 projects probably the year after that. So it's many decades of work, and I've never ever said to myself, okay, I have to do this now, I have to start this now, and it has to finish now. So even when I've been commissioned, sometimes I've done a body of work for commission, but that's only been the beginning, and it might well be that the commission raises some resources, and then I'll step back and say, right, okay, I did that commission 3 years ago or 10 years ago even, and where am I now with that work? So I think this idea of giving yourself time and giving yourself the space to experience and think is quite central to the kind of work that we do in urban.
Will it ever become a book that she could pick up and see London through your eyes?
I think so. Yeah, I mean there were plans some years ago to get more involved in sort of collaborative work with other street-based photographers, and there's a series of conversations we had about that, but it didn't happen. Not trying on my part. But yeah, I think in the long run, it has to be a publication of some kind. So who it's published by, I mean, I've been approached by various publishers and galleries as well. And where it goes, I don't know at this stage, because I'm actually still trying to work out what the final edit will be. It will be in some other format as well. I've been commissioned to write a film script to go with it as well. So there'll be other kinds of iterations around the work. I don't know, but I think it's probably, in terms of London, it's probably one of the biggest archives by a single photographer. I think it probably is. And it does need to come out, but it comes out in its own time. And I think this idea of sometimes you step back and you let something ferment, or you let it sort of mature, rather than rushing out. It's a bit like what I was talking about at the Wapping riot. I could have rushed back to the office, got my work in, got the work published, or I could have stayed. And actually, having stayed was the right thing to do, because I got a series of images from the one that were a bit crazy, but actually for me were stepping off points in terms of thinking about my own practice. And I think publishing is a little bit like that as well. Sometimes you have to just step back and give a project the space that it needs to develop. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to hear more from you, for those people that came along. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for the invitation.